Everyone see my presentation? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Satish, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar in NEET Labs and under the supervision of Dr. Jyoti Misha. And today I'm going to talk about one of our projects that involves the digital intervention of mindfulness intervention among physician trainees. And these are the contents of my presentation today. The workplace-related stress or burnout is quite common in every occupation. However, it is much more prevalent among physicians, and that has direct consequences over physician-patient outcome if it is left unmanaged. Further, the COVID-19 worsened the situation where physicians reporting higher emotional pain, insomnia, and depression. However, there are silver lining that was found from previous intervention research about the protective factor from burnout, wherein it was reported that mindfulness can serve as a strong protective factor from work-related stress and enhance well-being. So, and in one of the recent qualitative study among radio-oncologists, it was found those physicians having higher trait mindfulness reported lower burnout and higher life fulfillment. However, there are some potential challenges associated with implementing conventional format of mindfulness that typically is quite time intense, requiring up to 8 weeks of intervention, which kind of make physicians and trainees quite reluctant given their lack of time and their shift work and administrative burden. Therefore, as a solution, any digital intervention or such as smartphone-based app that can flexibly engage and without adding any further burden in their schedule could be a promising option. It also gives an advantage to researchers being much more quantifiable than a conventional mindfulness intervention. And in our own previous study in different population ranging from adolescent to adults, we observed that the gamification and feedback approach increased the adherence to such digital intervention. So for the current study, we have employed an in-house developed app called WellMind training app that has 4 modules in it: mind log, breathe, reflect, gratitude. And all these 4 would be completed in each session by every participant that will last for 10 to 15 minutes. And maximum up to 60 sessions a participant can complete over the period of 3 months. I would further elaborate about these 4 modules. So in the mind log module, the participant will be presented with a bunch of questions about their lifestyle, such as their diet, exercise, sleep, social life, as well as their mood on those given days. And they would respond to those questions every day. And the breathe module was our primary module that involved the intervention that we are talking about. So it was designed in a way that it has 10 different levels with increasing complexity with each level. And for every level, there was one common instruction for the participant that they would keep their eyes closed and breathe naturally and tap for each breath count or the sequence of breaths. And for sake of simplicity, each level indicated the number of breaths they would count and also the number of minutes they would spend on that given level. The app was designed in such a way that it can estimate if they would making response too fast, indicating their impulsivity, or they would making too slow response, indicating their distractedness, and would offer them a feedback in the form of gentle chime. And in third module, the reflect, it was basically like a journaling where they would be presented with one prompt questions, and over the period of 60 sessions, they would be given total 10 questions. And each question will be changed on every 7th day. So in this module, once they will be presented with a text box, and the total duration they leave the text box open will account for their total time spent on reflection. And the duration they spend in typing the text would estimate their active reflection time. And lastly, in the gratitude module, they would be presented with single question asking about how grateful they were feeling on that given day, and asking them to rate on the scale of 1 to 7. Now, moving on to the study design, it was a randomized control study designed in such a way that we would collect the data on 2 time points as a pre-test and post-test. And there were 2 groups, the WellMind group that underwent through WellMind training, and the control group that did not participate in any training. And each group has 2 visits. WellMind group has their second visit, that is post-assessment after the completion of the training period, and the control group after about 3 months of the wait period. And on both the time point, we collected their behavioral responses, mainly focusing on their self-compassion, mindfulness, given the nature of the training the WellMind group went through. And for the neurological assessment, we provided an introspective attention task to each participant in both groups, and with the simultaneous EEG recording. And after the post-assessment, we also followed up these participants to collect their behavioral responses at about 6 months from their baseline data collection. And based on the current research design and our intervention program, and also from previous literature review, we proposed that the WellMind group show higher scores of their mindfulness and compassion, indicating their improvement in these behavioral measures. And also the amount of time they would spend on training would be associated with their behavioral outcome. And there are previous studies in terms of neurological assessment that have consistently shown that default mode network activity can serve as a biomarker for any intervention such as mindfulness. Therefore, we hypothesize to observe any potential neuroplasticity in this default mode network. Also, since this task involved, an interoceptive attention task, so we also were curious to look into frontoparietal network and cinguloopercular network. These 2 networks are well known as a task-dependent attention network, where FPN is more, in the moment-to-moment attention, whereas the cinguloopercular network is associated with sustained attention. And for DMN, I already mentioned that have been shown to be showing negative activity when there is a task response, or it becomes hyperactivated when the person is in the state of mind wandering. So those are the rationale we looked into these networks, and we further also explored any possible association between these network activity with the behavioral outcomes. So now I will move on to the results and the demographics. So these are the layout of the demographics of these two groups, where we did not observe any differences on age, gender, and ethnicity between the two groups. However, there were mild differences on their burnout, such as emotional exhaustion and personal accomplishment. For this entire study, our primary focus were on two measures, that is state mindfulness and self-compassion. So on behavioral measures, we found that the WellMind group shows significant increase in their self-compassion score from the baseline at the post as well as the follow-up time point, but not the control group. The pattern of finding were quite similar on the state mindfulness as well. We observed a significant increase in the state mindfulness score from the baseline at post, but not at the follow-up. And also we did not see any significant changes in the control group on both the time points. We also further looked into the distribution of the training data in the WellMind group specifically. So this graph shows the x-axis, each participants, those like 22 participants, and the y-axis indicate how many training sessions each of these participants in the WellMind group underwent. And we also looked into the duration of the training with the behavioral outcome. So we observed those people had higher, training sessions. They reached to higher level of their breathe training. And those people also showed higher self-compassion score. And the pattern was quite similar on the state mindfulness as well. However, it did not reach to significance. Now on neurological measures, since this interoceptive attention task was quite similar to what the WellMind group was doing at the level 2, that they would count their breath 2 times and the tap to make the response. And they also had one explicit instruction that they would perform these tasks in the eyes closed condition. Therefore, we expected to observe the dominance of alpha power, and our data, exploration indeed showed that there was dominance of alpha power. Therefore, rest of our focus is based on alpha frequency. And I earlier mentioned in hypothesis that these are the 3 brain networks we are targeting. That is a frontoparietal, cinguloopercular, and default mode network activities. So among these 3 networks, we didn't observe any significant changes from baseline to post point on any of the control group on frontoparietal as well as cinguloopercular network. However, we did observe a significant reduction in WellMind group from the baseline at the post, and also the DMN activity in the WellMind group was lower than the control group, suggesting possibility of any neuroplasticity occurring there. We further looked into association between these behavioral outcomes with the neural measures. And in our exploration, we found that differences from post to pre on the self-compassion score was negatively associated with differences from post to pre in their default mode network activity, in partial correlation when we accounted both groups together. So in summary, the increase in self-compassion and state mindfulness in the WellMind group, but not in the control group, did indicate the efficacy of our intervention program. And as we hypothesized, we did observe that the magnitude of the training that individual went through was associated with their changes in the self-compassion scores. However, it wasn't found to be associated with the state mindfulness. And this selective reduction in the DMN activity was kind of resonating with the previous studies and the report in the review I mentioned, and also suggesting that there was an accumulation of neuroplasticity that would have been contributed by this WellMind training or breathe training in the WellMind group. And we further observed some extent the behavioral association with the changes in their DMN activity. So the major limitation of this study was that we had a very small sample size. However, the findings from the current study is going to lay the foundation of a large-scale interventional program at an organizational level, and that gives us that can give us more window to look into is significant impact on the burnout. So, however, we are also aware of the challenges we might face if we are intending to implement such intervention at organizational level. And some of those challenges were listed out by this group by Harvey et al. In recently. And the major reason being the reluctance of physicians to join such intervention program. And the major reason being that they could be quite protective about their confidentiality, or they might have some apprehension about their future career. And also there is a belief that they can manage those symptoms by themselves, or a self-stigma that doctors should be invincible. So based on many experts' review and our own assessment from our current study, we propose that if any intervention is implemented at the early stage of training in the physicians, may have much higher chances of success, and we would be able to see greater receptivity, adherence, and among physicians. So this was all in terms of my presentation. So in the end, I would like to thank all my lab members for their continuous support and guidance. And specifically, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion for supporting this research. Thank you.
Should be able to mute themselves as desired for any questions.
Thank you, Satish. If anyone in the audience has a question, we'd love to help answer that. Either Satish or I can tell you more about this work since this is carried out here. Lisa, welcome.
Hi, great, great talk, Satish. Thank you, and really interesting study. Obviously, very interested in my role as the director of the Center for Empathy and Compassion Training and Medical Education about the implications of this work. Two questions. One is, can you just say a little bit more about the breathe part of the app? Because I wasn't really clear how, for example, the breathing exercise would be different if you were at the level where you're focusing on self-compassion versus other compassion. So can you explain how, say, level 7 is different from level 8 in what they're hearing or seeing or doing?
Sure. Thank you for asking this question. So each level start with simplicity. So for example, at the level 1, they would be just say, so all these instructions were written in a text. So they will read the instruction and they will just start practicing, because they are performing even this breathe count in the eyes closed condition, and they were making tap. So once they are going through the practice, they would have this explicit instruction. So be kind to yourself, and or just say, and then whenever your focus distract, brings it back, and then keep tapping and keep counting your breath. And And so it starts with self, then maybe another higher level, they will be given instruction for keep somebody, think about somebody you love and care in your family, and then send them good wishes and goodwill. And then it will, in the next level, it may be thinking about yourself and then thinking somebody who is not very familiar, and then send good wishes to them. So, and then it could be reaching to a level that you can just think about the society overall. So it starts from individual to, you know, somebody who are familiar, somebody who is not familiar. So it just, you know, increasing its, you know, diameter to increase more and more. So that's how we have, you know, designed, you know, the complexity at every increasing level.
I see. So they are given an instruction about something to think about, and while they're thinking about that, they're supposed to also be counting their breaths.
Yes.
Repeatedly. Okay.
Jyoti can correct me if I'm...
Yeah, you said it perfectly, Satish. They're doing sort of a breath monitoring task. They're not, you know, they're depending on the level of breath monitoring they're on, they could be, you know, that's adaptive to the individual. They could be on just, you know, the first level of breath monitoring for a long time, which would be, you know, depending on how consistent they might be at monitoring their breath. But at the same time, they are scheduled to receive compassion instructions, depending on what session they're on. So session 1 versus the next week, session 7 would be level 2. So the compassion instructions are sort of weekly, the way compassion cultivation training happens, sort of on a weekly basis. You practice the same instruction over and over. But the breath counting and focus on the breath monitoring is developed with sort of a performance adaptive focus, and they're being done in parallel.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And then the other question I had is, so the suggestive findings for the pilot, you said that you found significant changes in the intervention group, but not in the control group. But was there a group by the time interaction? So was there a significant difference between the groups in the nature of the change across from pre to post?
Yeah, there was group difference only on the DMN and default mode network activity. Yeah, so here we can see on the DMN, we did observe, you know, the group difference as well.
And what was the nature of the group difference, the 0.003? It was a difference between, it was the difference of the difference, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but for the behavioral results, there were no significant difference of differences?
No, they were not.
Okay.
Yeah, I think at this stage, we're not powered for the behavioral scales. We didn't find them to be as stable and somewhat as the neurophysiological measures. Great. Well, if there are no further questions, we'll also have a joint discussion at the end around 3:50. I'd like to welcome our second presenter, Dr. Lindsey Powell. Dr. Powell is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology here at UCSD. She trained in developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience at Harvard University, where she did her PhD, and then she followed up with a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT. She leads the Social Cognition and Learning Lab, which studies how infants and young children think about people and their relationships, and how social partners can help young children learn about the world. Welcome, Lindsey. So excited to hear about your work.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And let me go ahead and share my screen. And thanks to the Sanford Institute as well for inviting me to talk about my work today, and for the generous funding of one of the 2 projects that I'll talk about. Okay. Oh. We practiced screen sharing before, but not audio sharing. And as I try to share my sound, I find that Zoom is asking me to update my an audio device or install a Zoom audio device. So instead, we will not share sound. And hopefully you'll be able to hear the sound in a couple of the slides through my computer. Sorry about that. All right, can you all see the slides now? Yeah, okay, great. So today I'm going to give two really brief talks in the 15 minutes that I have. In part one, I'm going to talk about an ongoing project that's funded by a Sanford Research Award on what motivates infant helping and compassion in the earliest stages at which infants engage in sort of helpful and empathically concerned behavior toward others. And then in part two, I'm going to talk about a recently completed study in the lab that looks at what infants understand about empathy. So how they think about the empathy that other people will express toward one another. So let's dive in with part one. So we know that infants, or we might call them toddlers at this stage, start to be helpful in the second year of life, and they also start to express concern for other people that are struggling. So here's an example from the work of Felix Warnikin and Michael Tomasello of an 18-month-old seeing someone in need and spontaneously offering some help.
Oh. Oh.
So this toddler figures out that the tall man is trying to put the magazines away in the cabinet, but that he can't because his hands are full. And then he politely opens the door so that the magazines can get put away in the cabinet. So what motivates this kind of behavior? Let's see, I've got it. There's a chat. Oh, can you hear the sound perfectly? Didn't need to stop for that, but okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. All right. Okay, so what might motivate those kinds of earliest acts of helping and compassion toward others? And when we think about empathy and compassion in adults, there's sort of two broad ways you could divide the kinds of empathy we feel toward other people's suffering. On the one hand, we might think about affective empathy, sort of feeling other people's pain or adopting their experiences as best we can, getting inside their shoes or their skin. Alternatively, we might think about sort of more cognitive empathy or trying to understand the thoughts and feelings that other people are having and to support them as best we can and to improve how they're feeling without actually sharing those experiences ourselves. And so both of those kinds of reactions to other people's experiences can motivate pro-social behavior, but we don't know what kind of role they play in the development of getting early empathy and helping off the ground. And it's difficult, of course, to ask toddlers why they're helping, right? Either that 18-month-old was very helpful, but he wasn't going to tell us, oh yeah, like, you know, I could feel the frustration of trying to get into the cabinet, or I understood his goal and I wanted to help him achieve it. We can't ask them to tell us which of those two things is driving their behavior, but we can measure brain activity in toddlers. And so we might be able to use some patterns of the way that their brain responds to other people in distress and how those responses predict their behavior to figure out what's motivating early helping. So in particular, there are sort of two separate networks of brain regions that tend to be more involved in the sort of understanding other people's thoughts and beliefs kind of empathy versus the feeling their pain or feeling their struggle kind of empathy. And so the first is the theory of mind network that represents other people's beliefs and emotions. This includes regions like the temporoparietal junction and the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. They're in the top bar. And then in the bottom bar, there's another set of regions that you might call the pain or the mirror network that responds a lot when we see other people experience pain in the kinds of situations that tend to elicit that visceral reaction from us, like we feel their pain. Right. And so, and here we've got somatosensory cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, insula, and also some premotor cortex. And so these are two distinct networks of brain regions that might sometimes interact with one another, but that are also spatially separate and often functionally separate. And so we might be able to measure pieces of these two different networks in toddlers when they're watching other people in distress and ask how those responses in these regions relate to their helping behavior. We know that these networks are present already, at least in preschool children. So here's an example of a study that took a naturalistic imaging approach and had children and also adults watch a Pixar short called Partly Cloudy, in which a stork happens to be assigned to a cloud that produces very dangerous and painful animals like porcupines and alligators. And throughout the movie, there's events where there's a lot of emotional content and you have to think about what the characters think or believe or feel. And there's also a lot of pratfalls and like sort of painful events where you can imagine the stork's pain. And if you look at the time course, sort of the average time course in all of the theory of mind regions of interest versus all the pain regions of interest, you can see that they respond during these events. And in particular, you can see that they're already responding during these different events in children as young as 3 years of age. So there's some differences in the purple line there is adults, the red through blue lines are children increasing in age. And you can see some development in terms of how robustly these networks respond to these different kinds of events. But already at 3, you see the basic pattern of the theory mind region responding to thinking about other people's emotions and beliefs, and the pain regions responding to other people's pain. So in our study, we're trying to ask these 2 questions. Do regions from either of these brain networks respond when infants see other people struggle? And the second one is, do individual differences in these networks predict infants helping or empathic concern? And so here's how we're going about doing that. In part 1, you can put toddlers in an fMRI scanner, but it's quite hard to get high quality data while they stay still and watch movies. So in part 1 of our study, we're having infants participate in an FNIRS experiment, where FNIRS is a kind of imaging technology that measures blood flow in the brain. It measures the same kind of hemodynamic response as fMRI, but with lights that can be embedded in a cap that a baby wears while they sit on their parent's lap. While they wear the FNIRS cap, they're watching videos of people experience either sort of frustrating or struggling events like spilling a drink or stubbing their toe, or failing to get a box of toys open. And in other videos, they're watching success as sort of a baseline control set of videos. And we've designed a cap and validated it in adults that measures from both theory of mind regions like TPJ and MPFC, and also pain network regions like somatosensory cortex and IFG. This is still in progress. We were able to do a lot of prep work for this project during the pandemic, like use Zoom experiments to develop videos that elicited lots of expressions of concern from infants, and to develop some helping tasks that worked over Zoom as well. But we're just now, in the last 5 months or so, getting the data collection phase of the study going with FNIRS in the lab. The other thing that toddlers do is once we take off that cap with all those wires, we also have them engage in some helping tasks where, for example, we're looking for a lost object that's actually in a rather obvious location, and we see if they'll point it out to us, or we've spilled some blocks and we see if they'll help us pick them up. And so when we've finished collecting the sample, we'll be able to answer these 2 different questions about whether the theory of mind network is already responsive to other people's struggles in toddlerhood. I'm so sorry, someone is repeatedly knocking at my door. I'm just going to tell them to go away. Hang on 1 second. Hi, I'm giving a talk. I'm sorry. Yeah. So sorry about that. Okay, and then in part 2, we'll be able to ask if individual differences in the magnitude of response in either sets of regions predicts how much helping toddlers engage in. Okay, so that was a brief overview on the project that we've got going on. And now we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk briefly about a study that we're doing to look at how infants understand empathy. And what do I mean by understand empathy? How could infants really understand empathy if they don't have sort of language to talk about it yet? Well, take this children's story as an example. So in this story, there's an elephant named Gerald who has an ice cream cone. He's very excited about eating it, but he thinks to himself, Piggy is my best friend. Should I share my ice cream with her? And while he's deliberating whether or not to share his ice cream, one thought crosses his mind, which is, what if she's sad somewhere? Then he imagines that if he gives her his ice cream, that will cheer her up. And then in turn, that makes him happy, right? He says, then my best friend will be happy. And so on the one hand, he's sort of explaining his train of thought, but you can also see in his expression that he's experiencing an emotion when he thinks about his friend's emotion. And we expect the children who read the storybook to be able to understand where that kind of empathic emotion would come from, that he's happy about someone else's joy, and that it's particularly heightened by the fact that the 2 of them are best friends. And so we're curious whether infants expect vicarious emotions. Do they expect people to feel happy or sad about things that happen to other people? And also, do they think that these emotions are linked to relationships? Do they think that people feel maybe heightened empathic emotions for people they're close to or familiar with versus people they aren't? So why would we want to know the answers to these questions? One reason to know is to understand how early infants consider empathy to be normative, how early they think that empathy is the way you should respond to other people. And then we could investigate, for example, factors that promote or dampen that belief in the normativity of empathy. And we also want to know how early infants can use empathy as information about other people's character or their relationships, right? So when you see it, that Gerald think, oh, then my best friend will be happy and feel really good about it, you think either that Gerald is a really nice guy because he cares about other people's feelings, you think he's really close to Piggy because he cares so much about how she feels, or maybe a little bit of both, right? And so it might be important for understanding the development of infants and children's own relationships to know if they can use empathy to map other people's relationships and also to judge the strength of their own relationships. Okay, so we're going to ask if infants expect other people to feel happy for each other. But first, how do we know when they expect people to feel happy for themselves? So there's a series of studies that we're going to build on in our own work that show infants something like the following. There's an outcome, like a character succeeds in jumping over a wall. And then in test trials, that character either responds in a happy way to that outcome or in a sad way. In this kind of case where the character is successful, infants, and we're going to measure their looking time to the two different kinds of responses, positive or negative responses to success, because longer looking in infants is a sign of surprise. And so in this kind of scenario, we find that infants look longer at things that are when people respond negatively to their own success. So when the character jumps over the wall, which he's been trying to do, and then responds with sadness, they're surprised relative to if he responds with happiness. Lest you think they're just looking longer at sad emotions, which are salient. If the character fails to jump over the wall, bounces, knocks off of it and falls backward, and then responds with either positive or negative affect, infants actually don't have an expectation about what kind of emotion the character will show. And this is actually in line with, there's some evidence suggesting that they are less sure about when to expect negative emotions relative to positive emotions across a bunch of different situations. Okay. But infants expect people to be happy about their own success. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start out in two different blocks of trials by introducing infants to two different relationships, or here's what we did rather, I guess. So here's an introduction to an affiliation, a pair of friends. So hopefully you can tell these guys do things together. They like to hang out. And then over here, I'm going to show you the antagonistic pair. So at the beginning of each block, infants saw one of those two relationship introductions. And then the next thing that happened in the blocks were that, again, just like the study I showed you before, one character was trying to jump over a wall and get to a mat on the other side. But now there's a character watching, the other character in the pair is watching from above on that little platform, and they're the one who's going to have the emotional response to the outcome of the jump, right? So these were the pair of friends. And so in one kind of test trial, the observer is going to watch his friend succeed in jumping over the wall and respond with happiness. And in the other kind of trial, he's going to watch his friend jump over the wall successfully again. But instead respond with sadness. And so we did these kinds of events for both kinds of blocks. So sometimes the observer is watching their friend succeed, and sometimes they're watching this rival who they kind of butted heads with succeed. And in each case, we're again measuring looking time from the infants in response to these emotional responses to the successful jump. And here's what we find. In the affiliated block, we find that infants look significantly longer when the friend responds to the jumper's success with sadness rather than happiness, suggesting they expected, like Gerald feels happy at the thought of his friend being happy, they expected friends to be happy for one another. But in the anti-affiliated case, in the antagonistic block where the two butted heads, there was no difference in looking between the two kinds of outcomes, and the pattern across the two sets of relationships was different. So infants have this expectation that people will feel empathy for others, but especially so when the two people are friends with one another and not necessarily if they're rivals. In some current follow-ups that we're engaged in right now, we're asking if infants can make the reverse inference if they see people respond with empathy versus counter empathy to people's outcomes. Do they infer relationships between them? And we're also asking what this reasoning about empathy, counter empathy, and relationships looks like in children and adults, and how it maps onto computational models of reasoning about emotions and relationships. And then some future directions. First, how does understanding empathy relate to children's own expression of empathy? Does having some understanding of what empathy conveys about relationships actually enhance the degree to which children express empathy toward one another or toward adults? And then, do individual differences in expectations of empathy predict help seeking? Are the infants or children who expect people to respond with this matching congruent vicarious emotions the one who think that people will also respond by being helpful in the world? So is empathy a sign of how friendly the world is in some ways? So here's a thank you to the members of my lab who are helping to conduct these studies, and also to the Sanford Institute for supporting our work. Thanks so much. I'm happy to take questions if people have any.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsey. That was great. Do you, if I don't see a hand up, so I'll start out with a question for you. In the infants, when you see the responses with, you know, the positive or the negative emotional outcome for any given child, are they pretty highly correlated in terms of how they might respond to one or the other, or are they pretty distinct or not predictive of each other?
You mean, are the children who expect empathy from a friend the same ones who might expect more empathy from a rival, or do those two diverge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in fact they're slightly negatively correlated with one another. So the infants who are showing the strongest expectations of empathy from the friends are also the ones showing the weakest expectations of empathy from their rivals. And this fits with a model of emotions that we have where what it means to care about someone is to sort of place a higher weight on their reward values. And so I think the idea is that infants who are really good at representing that emotion, that relationship variable and tracking how much weight people put on one another's rewards will both be the infants who make the best inference about expecting empathy in the friendship case, but also the ones who are least likely to expect it in the rival case. Yeah.
Hey, Lindsey, I wonder if could we go back to just the little paradigm, that the jumping over the wall thing, and
Sure, yeah.
just to look at that a little bit. I may have missed something.
Yeah.
Probably missed something. So when I see, okay, so I could barely, is there a smile on the face of the person? Yeah, I can barely see the smile. And is that, so there was a little, I didn't understand whether the smile was, or the frown were readily seen by the infant, that they really said, oh, I see a smile, I see a frown. So that was one question. But I guess if I look very carefully, and maybe they've got better vision than I do, maybe one sees that. And then the other thing is the jumping. So in the affiliated block, they're jumping together, and that looks happy to me. It looks like they're happy together, they're resonating together. But on the affiliated block, when there's a negative response, in other words, there's a frown, it's that same jumping. And I'm wondering, is there a need to distinguish jumping happy versus something sad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so first I'll say these are obviously the smallest images of the study. These were slightly larger, but even so, you were seeing sort of screens of the stimuli within the larger Zoom screen. When the infants see it, it's full screen, and we have minimum computer sizes they have to do the study on. So we know it's more likely they're able to see the facial expression of the observer than maybe you are here in this presentation. And there's also that audio sound effect of the giggling and laughing in the happy case and the crying in the sad case.
Oh, I see. I may have missed that also. Yeah.
Yeah. And then with the jumping on the platform, so our concern with the with one thing we worried about is that their attention would be on the jumper right after success, and we needed somehow to get them to pay attention to the observer and make sure they noticed that that was the character that was having the emotional response, not the jumper themselves.
Okay.
So yeah, so we used the jumping on the platform right before the emotional response as a way to just draw attention to the observer and say, hey, this is the person who's reacting now. But I see your point about how the same kind of jump had been involved in the affiliative interaction before. Yeah, that's interesting. We think that in that, I mean, our impression is that in that case, it's not the jumping itself that's positive, but the kind of, like you mentioned, like the kind of resonance or synchrony of the jumping that's positive.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're still able to differentiate and respond, and they're surprised when they see the sad response, but not when they see the happy response. I should mention that it's not just that they're surprised by the jumping followed by a sad response, because in another study we had the friend fail. And in that case, they don't look longer at the sad response than the happy response. So this is a case where they saw they saw two different pairs of friends instead of one pair of friends and one pair of rivals. And then in one set of trials, the jumper succeeded, but in the other set of trials, the jumper failed. And just like that previous study that I mentioned before, we found no difference in looking to the happy versus sad response of the observer when the friend had failed. But we did observe the sort of expectation of happiness and the longer looking to sad when they succeeded. So I think it's not just looking at that exact event, but rather looking at it in context of both the outcome and the relationship together that mean that infants should expect the observer to be happy about what occurred.
I mean, so another question, I guess, would be, are we just seeing a negativity bias in the case of the affiliated group and no negativity bias in the case of the non-affiliated group? You're not seeing differences in the non-affiliated group, you are in the affiliated group. And is that a negativity bias then that sort of reinforces the idea that there is an empathic activity when you're affiliated versus non-affiliated? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so then I think you'd expect them to look longer at the sad response when their friend is around, regardless of how the jumping worked out, right? But they didn't, right? The other thing I'll say is, and maybe this is like kind of a hopeful note, but we had a version of the study where we had a slightly different introduction, where there were two friends, and then there was this guy who was just kind of hanging around and like didn't jump with them, just did his own thing in the background, but they never actually competed. And then just like in the study I showed you in the talk with affiliated and antagonistic, we had the observer watch either kind of guy try to succeed. And in that case, their strongest expectation of empathy was for the friend, but they actually had a bit of a weak expectation of empathy for the sort of like sort of ambiguously like non-affiliated individual as well, suggesting that their baseline might be to expect empathy even in cases where there's not super strong affiliation, which would be, I don't know, would make me feel good about infants' expectations for the world.
Just one really quick question. Do you look at the face? Can you record the face of the infant when they're looking?
Yeah, we do. We record their faces so that we can measure their looking time. Are you interested in their facial expressions?
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, are you wondering if they like express surprise or if they express concern, or what kind of facial expression?
I think I just want to know what they do. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not sure. I'm pretty sure that looking longer is real, but it would just be interesting to know. So what does her face actually look like?
Yeah. And sometimes you get like raised eyebrows of surprise and that kind of thing. It's harder to code and less reliable than looking time, so we often don't code it. But yeah, it's nice when we see it because it sort of confirms our impression of what the method means. Chris.
Lindsey, this is super cool work. Thanks for sharing this. I have a couple like design modifications I'm wondering if you've considered about what they might imply here. So one is just basically reversing your procedure. And instead of first showing the relationship, is antagonistic versus friendly, and then showing the reaction, just doing it in reverse. Because based on your setup and the Gerald and Peggy stuff and everything, I thought we were going to infer the relationship from the empathic response. So that's one potential modification is to use this response. And I think what we're seeing here is like either positive empathy or envy, jealousy, something in that domain. And so that's one. And then the second is, have you thought about looking at responses to failure? And I know you showed that, and I think it was part 1 of the study that you had this sort of paradigm. But that way you can also look at either these, responses of sympathy, compassion, if, the person fails to get over the wall, the ally or competitor, or Schadenfreude, if they're really happy that their rival or their friend failed. So that, I don't know, I'm just wondering if that reveals anything beyond what you have here.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the first one, so one of the things like our current infant study is this like reverse direction that you mentioned. So now we've got them showing these empathic responses at the beginning, and then and we have them sort of watching 2 different jumpers, and they empathize with one and not the other. And then the observer approaches each of them and does like a little synchronous dance with each of them. And the idea is that might be surprising for the one that he didn't empathize with versus the one that they did empathize with, right? So we're on that case now. And with children, we're sort of trying to ask both directions at once. So we've got a set of vignettes where there's 2 children, and something happens is either good or bad for one of the children. And in half the questions, we give them information about the empathic response of the other child or the counter-empathic response of the other child and ask them to infer the relationship. And in the other half of the trials, we give them the relationship information and ask them to infer the likely emotion in response. And so hopefully we'll be able to share those data soon. There's some exciting, I'd say like from the pilot data, it really looks strongly like children expect Gluckschmerz. They expect people to feel bad when people they don't like do well, but they actually don't expect Schadenfreude. They think that if something bad happens to someone else, even if you don't like them, you should feel bad for them, or that you will feel bad for them, actually, which is kind of nice, right? And then of course, if you're friends, they just expect empathy no matter what kind of outcome, positive or negative. But yeah, I think in older children, these are like 4 to 7-year-old children, we might also be better able to ask this question about, well, right. And so those studies, in fact, those cases do involve some situations where there's a negative outcome and we expect the observers to feel bad, right? A problem that we have with this infant study is that it's not super clear. No one's been able really to get infants to expect people to react negatively to their own failures. So it's hard to say what it means if they don't expect vicarious sadness at failure either. And we're not really sure why they're less clear about negative emotions in response to these kinds of events. It could be the kind of thing where like if they fall down, or like, they're trying to, I don't know, play with the toy and they're failing to play with the toy, or they're trying to walk and they're failing to walk. Their parents often kind of like pump them up, right? And try to get them not to feel negative emotions and try to get them to keep trying a little bit, rather than just kind of like expressing like, oh no, that's so terrible that you fell down, right? That's not the way you respond to a kid when they just sort of fall a little bit. And so one reason why we might not be able to see expectations of empathic sadness in response to failure is because they don't even expect the actor themselves to be sad when they fail. But yeah, and so in this case, we were finding that when the observer watched a friend fail, they no longer expect happiness. They're no longer surprised by sadness relative to happiness, but they also don't show the reverse expectation and show that they're surprised when the individual's happy. And we wonder if that might be kind of related to the way that parents respond to little failures in infants' lives. But yeah, those are great directions. We're excited about them.
Thanks a lot. Now I'll pause here, but if there is a time at the end, if you could talk more about expectations of children versus adults, whether it's the same, whether it's not, that would be fun too.
Yeah.
Well, we do just have 3 minutes remaining. So Lindsey, again, talk about what Chris mentioned about expectations. And also I was curious about, is there, since our work has been more about training in adults, in children at some age, are some of these processes flexible, given any kind of training, and what that might be? Is it just like a one-time exposure? People have done like multiple days of bringing in kids to the lab, but like, even if it's not infants or, about younger children. So just implications for, when we might introduce empathy trainings.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not sure how young people have tried to engage in empathy training. I know a lot about theory of mind training and training kids to think about other people's beliefs, but a lot less about training them to think about vicarious emotions. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons that we wanted to investigate these questions, is because it's not totally clear. I think there's been work showing before that children think there's a norm of empathy, and I think you can enforce that norm of sort of not laughing at or like mocking other people's pain. But I'm not sure that there's been a lot of attention to sort of training kids to express positive empathy for other people's successes. I mean, it really feels surprising to us that no one has asked these questions about when do kids expect empathic and counter-empathic responses before, but it also seems like people haven't. So maybe this will be the first step to sort of recognizing that we can train kids to think about empathy. And I think that a recent trend in the adult literature with empathy is sort of teaching people that maybe empathy across relationship boundaries is more useful than you might have thought it was, right? That empathizing with people across political divides, for example, can have positive outcomes. So, so maybe one lesson from sort of learning that children already expect empathy to be somewhat parochial is that training can start that much earlier, right? That we could sort of get kids to think about the value of not just, not mocking other people's losses, but also celebrating their wins and feeling extra concern for them relative to what they might earlier on. I'm sorry, I actually don't know of any studies that have asked that have looked at training children to feel more empathy. There must be some. I imagine Nancy Eisenberg has done this kind of work. I know lots on like sort of looking at early signs of concern in toddlers and seeing that those are the kids who are more helpful when they're age 4. But training, I don't know.
Yeah, super interesting. Maybe more avenues for our institute to look into for future work.
Yeah.
So I guess, Catherine, we're at 4 p.m. So I think this will be time to adjourn.
Yes, I'd just like to thank everybody for their attendance. Special thanks to Dr. Misha for moderating that really helpful discussion, and for all of our presenters. Thank you so much. We are so excited to be able to share some of the wonderful work that all of our investigators are doing. And join us next quarter for our next installment.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.